Under the golden glow of New York's skyline, billionaire Maverick Knight lived in a world built on power, privilege, and precision. A man who believed he could control everything, including who was worthy of standing beside him. He was cold, calculated, and confident, a master of industries who conquered boardrooms but never his own heart. To him, black women were invisible, not hated, simply dismissed, as though they didn't belong in his perfect, polished world. But everything changed the night he saw her. Phoebe Bernard, a woman whose elegance carried strength, whose presence demanded respect without asking for it. She wasn't just beautiful. She was brilliance wrapped in grace, intelligence veiled in calm power. For the first time, the man who ruled empires felt his certainty crack. One glance shattered years of prejudice. One conversation ignited a storm that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, identity, and humanity. What began as an unexpected spark turned into a journey of redemption. Their worlds clashed. The billionaire who thought he had it all, and the woman who taught him what everything really meant. Together they faced judgment, scandal, and whispers from a world unready for their truth. But through it all, their love didn't just survive. It transformed them both. Because sometimes the greatest empire a man can build is the one built on love, respect, and change. Maverick Knight was not a man easily distracted. At 39, he had conquered industries, built empires, and amassed wealth so vast it could sustain generations. Control was his trademark. His boardrooms fell silent when he entered. His rivals bowed or were crushed, and women adored him, though he offered them nothing more than passing moments. But one thing Maverick Knight had never done was entertain the idea of black women, not as friends, not as lovers, not as anything more than fleeting figures in the crowd. It wasn't open hatred. It was worse, dismissal. Somewhere deep in the corridors of his privileged upbringing, a prejudice had taken root, the belief that they were not his kind of women, that they didn't belong in his world. And so his life continued in perfect rhythm, structured, predictable, untouched, until that night. The rooftop of the Avalon Grand Hotel shimmered under golden light. Thousands of fairy lights wrapped around trellises, crystal chandeliers sparkled above velvet lounges, and the smooth hum of a jazz quartet floated through the air. The city skyline stretched like a painted horizon, towering skyscrapers piercing the dusk, the river below glimmering like liquid glass. It was Arthur Langston's 50th birthday, and Maverick attended more out of courtesy than pleasure. Arthur, an old Harvard companion and fellow billionaire, had a reputation for extravagant displays of wealth. Guests mingled in designer tuxedos and sequined gowns, laughter bubbling between champagne flutes and soft music. Maverick stood near the balcony, a glass of scotch in hand, his sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd with practiced detachment. He had already shaken hands with a senator, declined 2 investment proposals, and endured small talk with a model who seemed more interested in his yacht than in him. Everything felt routine, predictable until she appeared. She entered like a vision. The first thing Maverick noticed was her gown, sleek, deep purple satin that sculpted her figure and shimmered beneath the chandelier's glow. Then came her presence, poised, regal, and self-assured, each step as if the ground yielded to her command. And finally her face, delicate features, radiant dark skin, and eyes that carried both warmth and a quiet, undeniable strength. Maverick froze. Something inside him shifted, unfamiliar and unsettling. He wasn't a man who faltered, yet his heartbeat betrayed him, pounding harder with every step she took. He told himself to look away. Old instincts whispered, not her, not your kind. But his eyes disobeyed, drawn to her like steel to a magnet. Who is she? He murmured under his breath. No one else seemed to notice her the way he did. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and music swelled. But for Maverick, the entire scene had blurred into stillness. There was only her. She approached the bar, ordered a drink with a soft smile, and leaned casually against the counter. Maverick finished his scotch in one swift motion, straightened his tuxedo, and walked forward, each step heavier than the last. For the first time in years, he felt something strange. Nervousness. "Good evening," he greeted when he finally reached her, his voice, usually deep and commanding, carried a subtle hint of uncertainty. She turned toward him, her eyes sweeping over his face before a polite, measured smile curved her lips. "Good evening," she replied. Up close, she was even more mesmerizing. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun, diamond earrings catching the light with every movement. There was no fear or awe in her gaze, only quiet assessment, as though she were deciding whether he was worth her time. "I don't believe we've met," Maverick said, extending his hand. "Maverick Knight." Her brow lifted slightly, perhaps recognizing the name, but she didn't gush or feign excitement like most did. Instead, she shook his hand with calm confidence. "Phoebe Bernard," she said simply. "Phoebe." The name rolled through him like velvet. "A pleasure to meet you, Phoebe," Maverick said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Arthur certainly knows how to throw a party." "He does," she agreed, glancing around the glowing rooftop. "Though I've never been much for all this glitter. Too much sparkle makes it hard to see what's real." Maverick blinked. No one ever said things like that at these events. Most were too busy pretending they belonged. Her words were grounded, unpretentious, like refreshing. "I couldn't agree more," he said, intrigued. "These events are more performance than pleasure." Her lips twitched, amused. "And what role are you playing tonight, Mr. Knight?" For a second, he was caught off guard. No one ever spoke to him that way. Teasing, almost challenging. Women usually bent themselves around his ego, but not her. "I suppose I'm playing the bored billionaire," he replied dryly. "And you?" "The observer," Phoebe said smoothly, taking a sip of her drink. "I like watching people pretend. It tells you more about them than their words ever could." He chuckled, his interest deepening. "You're not like most people here, and you're not as charming as you think," she countered. Lightly, Maverick laughed, genuinely, a sound so rare it startled even him. What began as a polite exchange unfolded into an effortless conversation that carried them through the evening. They talked about travel, books, and music. She spoke about her love for architecture, how cities were shaped not only by buildings but by the dreams of the people within them. And for the first time in years, Maverick found himself listening, not waiting to speak, truly listening. He even surprised himself, revealing fragments of his guarded life, the pressure of power, the loneliness of success, the walls he'd built so high that even he couldn't climb them. With anyone else, he would have remained silent, but with her the words came easily. As the night waned and guests began to leave, Maverick realized something startling. He didn't want it to end. "I enjoyed talking to you, Phoebe," he said softly. Her smile was warm but unreadable. "I enjoyed it too." He hesitated before pulling out his phone. "Would you mind if I had your number? Maybe we could continue this conversation another time, somewhere less glittery." She studied him for a long moment, her silence a quiet test. Then, finally, she nodded and recited her number. When he saved it, something inside him clicked, like a door opening. Later that night, as Maverick sat in the back of his Rolls-Royce, city lights flickering against the tinted windows, he stared at her name glowing on his screen. Phoebe Bernard. He should have been irritated with himself. This wasn't him. He didn't chase, didn't get distracted, didn't lower his guard. Especially not for someone who represented everything he'd once dismissed. And yet, as he leaned back against the leather seat, loosening his tie, the world felt different. Unpredictable. And for the first time in years, he liked it. The billionaire who had never once considered loving a black woman had just spent the night utterly captivated by one. And deep down he knew his life had just changed forever. Maverick Knight was not a man who impressed easily. He had met presidents, queens, tech prodigies, and artists whose names shaped history. Yet the morning after Arthur Langston's birthday party, as sunlight spilled through the glass walls of his penthouse office, his mind was consumed by just one name, Phoebe Bernard. He had typed it into his phone almost absent-mindedly the night before, but the thought of her lingered, sharp and insistent. Who was she really? A woman that poised, that intelligent, that magnetic. She had to be more than a charming guest at a social event. A knock on his office door broke his thoughts. His assistant Peter entered carrying the day's agenda. Maverick nodded distantly as Peter outlined meetings, calls, and reports. He barely heard a word until Peter mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "And Richard Bernard's daughter will be attending the corporate summit tomorrow. Shall I prepare your briefing?" Maverick's head snapped up. Wait, Bernard's daughter? Peter blinked, surprised at his boss's sudden interest. Yes, sir. Phoebe Bernard. She's the managing director of Bernard Global now. Runs most of their operations while her father focuses on investments. Maverick leaned back slowly, a knowing smile curving at the edge of his mouth. Richard Bernard was a titan, one of the few men Maverick truly respected in business. And his daughter, Phoebe, wasn't just beautiful and graceful. She was powerful, accomplished, a woman who built her own name rather than standing in someone else's shadow. It wasn't infatuation anymore. It was admiration. The following evening, the Crystal Pavilion gleamed beneath a canopy of glass and steel as the nation's most powerful figures gathered for the annual corporate summit. Maverick was used to commanding attention when he arrived. Conversations paused, cameras turned, and smiles appeared out of obligation. But tonight, none of that mattered. He was searching for her, and then he saw her. Phoebe stood beside a sleek display of architectural models, her hair in soft curls that brushed her shoulders, her charcoal suit tailored to perfection. She radiated confidence. Every word, every gesture carried quiet authority. She wasn't there to impress. She belonged. Maverick watched from a distance as a group of young executives crowded around her, captivated while she explained Bernard Global's new expansion project. Her voice was steady, intelligent, and commanding. She wasn't just part of the conversation, she led it. When the small crowd dispersed, Maverick finally approached. Ms. Bernard, he greeted, his tone formal yet warm, her lips curved into a knowing smile. Mr. Knight, twice in 1 week and people might start to think you're following me. Perhaps I am, he replied smoothly. Or perhaps fate is simply being kind to me. She chuckled softly, though her eyes gleamed with amusement. You don't believe in fate, Maverick. You believe in control. That caught him off guard. She was right. He had said those very words to her during their first conversation. The fact that she remembered unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. I'm beginning to think you're far more dangerous than you look, he said, a smirk tugging at his lips. And I'm beginning to think you're not nearly as untouchable as you pretend, she replied easily. What began as casual encounters soon turned into something else. At first, they met under the guise of business, lunches to discuss mergers, dinners to compare market forecasts, quiet afternoons in her office reviewing sustainability projects. But somewhere between the spreadsheets and the shared glances, something softer began to bloom. They talked for hours, sometimes about numbers, sometimes about life. She teased him without fear, challenged his ideas, and occasionally ignored his calls just to remind him he wasn't the center of her universe. He found her independence maddening but intoxicating. Maverick admired her work ethic, her calm precision, her refusal to rely on her father's legacy. Phoebe in turn admired his relentless ambition, his sharp intelligence, and the rare glimpses of vulnerability he showed only when he forgot to guard himself. For the first time in his life, Maverick felt seen, not as a billionaire or an icon, but as a man. But the world around them was not as generous. One evening, over a private dinner, Maverick's longtime business partner, Charles Wentworth, leaned across the table with a smug grin. I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time with Richard Bernard's daughter, he drawled. Maverick didn't react. And, Charles swirled his wine lazily, surely you know what people are saying. A man like you with, well, a woman like her, it doesn't exactly fit the image. Maverick's jaw tightened. And what image is that? Charles gave a careless shrug. You know how society is. Investors have expectations. The board, that's enough. Maverick's voice was low, dangerous, the kind that silenced entire rooms. Charles blinked, startled, and dropped the subject, but the damage had been done. That night, as Maverick drove home through the glittering city streets, anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, not at Phoebe but at himself, because deep down he knew Charles had merely voiced what he himself had once believed. The prejudice he thought buried had never truly died. It had only been sleeping. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, another gala, another night of glittering lights and polite facades. Maverick and Phoebe arrived together, instantly commanding attention. She was breathtaking in a navy gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Heads turned. Whispers followed. For most of the night, everything was perfect, until a half-drunk socialite sneered just loud enough for Maverick to hear. Is he serious? Maverick Knight with her? Must be a phase. He'll come to his senses soon enough. The words sliced through the air. Maverick stopped cold. Phoebe, sensing the tension, squeezed his arm gently, silently asking him to let it go. But he couldn't. He turned, his voice cutting through the music. If you have something to say about the woman I'm with, he said evenly, say it to me directly. Otherwise, keep your ignorance to yourself. The room went still. The socialite flushed scarlet and stumbled away under 100 watchful eyes. No one else dared speak. When Maverick turned back, Phoebe's expression had softened. Not with fear, but with something warmer. Admiration. Why did you do that? She asked quietly once they were alone on the terrace. Because you deserve respect, he said simply. And because I refuse to let anyone reduce you to less than who you are. For a long moment she looked at him, her gaze unreadable. Then she reached up, her fingers brushing his jaw. You're changing, Maverick Knight, she whispered. And I can't decide if I'm impressed. Or terrified. He caught her hand gently and pressed it to his cheek. Be both. From that night forward, something shifted between them. They spent weekends wandering through art galleries, debating over paintings and what defined genius. They took long drives to quiet restaurants where no one knew their names. In those moments, Maverick began to open up about the ghosts of his past, the coldness of his childhood home, the relentless expectations, the loneliness no amount of money could silence. And Phoebe, in turn, shared her battles, the endless pressure of proving herself, the sting of subtle racism in boardrooms, the quiet exhaustion of being underestimated and then forced to excel twice as hard to be seen. They found solace in each other's honesty. Brick by brick. The walls around Maverick's heart began to crumble, not from force but from her steady, patient warmth. By the end of that season, it was undeniable. They weren't just colleagues. They weren't just friends. They were something more. Maverick knew it the moment he kissed her. It was a quiet evening after a long meeting. There were no words, no plans. He simply looked at her, at the way her eyes softened when she smiled, and leaned in. She didn't pull away. The kiss was soft, hesitant, but real. And in that moment, Maverick Knight and the man who had sworn he'd never look twice at a black woman fell. Completely and without hesitation. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the fall. The morning after their first kiss, sunlight spilled through Phoebe's penthouse curtains, painting soft gold across the room. She stood by the window, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the city come alive beneath her. The moment replayed in her mind. His touch, his words, the quiet vulnerability behind his eyes. Maverick Knight, the man known for his steel composure and untouchable aura, had let her in. She smiled faintly. It wasn't a fairy tale moment, nor was it reckless passion. It was something deeper, a quiet recognition between two souls who had fought their way through judgment, ambition, and loneliness. When her phone buzzed, the spell broke. It was a message from her father. Breakfast. Urgent. At Bernard Global's private dining suite, Richard Bernard sat with the same commanding presence he carried in every boardroom. His silver hair gleamed under the light, and his expression was calm but stern. Phoebe entered, her heels clicking softly across the marble floor. You called? Yes. He gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. I received a call this morning, Richard began, setting down his tablet. From Charles Wentworth. He tells me you and Maverick Knight have become close. Phoebe didn't flinch. We've been collaborating professionally, and yes, we're getting to know each other personally. Richard sighed heavily. Phoebe, do you have any idea what you're walking into? The Knights aren't just a business dynasty. They represent a world that has never welcomed us. They'll tolerate your intelligence, your success, but not your presence in his life. I don't live my life seeking anyone's tolerance. Father, she replied, her voice steady. His gaze softened, pride and fear flickering behind his eyes. I know, you're your mother's daughter, too strong for your own good, but strength doesn't shield you from cruelty. Phoebe reached across the table, resting her hand over his. You taught me how to stand tall in rooms that weren't built for me. Let me handle this one too. Meanwhile, across the city, Maverick was facing his own storm. His father, Henry Knight, had summoned him to the family estate, a sprawling mansion that looked more like a monument than a home. Maverick hadn't been there in months, but the tone of his father's message had left no room for avoidance. Henry stood by the grand piano, his reflection sharp in the glass. So it's true then. You're seeing her. Maverick didn't bother denying it. Yes, Henry turned, his expression icy. You've forgotten who you are. Who we are. The Knights built an empire through legacy, class, and alliances, not distractions. Maverick's jaw tightened. Phoebe isn't a distraction. Then what is she? A statement? An experiment? Henry's voice dripped with disdain. Do you have any idea what the investors will think when they see you parading around with her? Maverick stepped closer, anger flashing in his eyes. She's not someone I'm parading, Father. She's someone I respect, someone I care about. Henry's voice lowered to a cruel whisper. She's someone who doesn't belong in our world. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick, heavy, unbreakable. Then Maverick spoke, his voice calm but firm. Then maybe it's your world that doesn't belong to me anymore. He turned and walked away, the echo of his footsteps cutting through generations of prejudice. The weeks that followed tested them both. Whispers spread through the media, photos of them together, anonymous sources questioning her motives, tabloids painting her as a gold digger chasing power. Online, the hate was vicious. Comment sections filled with slurs and insinuations. Maverick offered to issue a public statement, but Phoebe stopped him. We don't defend what doesn't need defense, she said. We just keep moving. And so they did. They attended charity galas together, hosted joint business conferences, and quietly continued building their relationship in the background of chaos. Every time someone tried to use race as a weapon, they countered it with excellence, letting their results speak louder than rumors. But the world wasn't done testing them yet. One night, during a high-profile investors' gala, the tension reached its peak. The room was filled with elite guests, old money, corporate heirs, and powerful families. Maverick and Phoebe arrived together, poised and elegant. But as they mingled, they could feel the stares, polite smiles masking judgment. During the auction, a board member's wife leaned toward Phoebe with a sugar-coated smile. I must say you're incredibly composed, Miss Bernard. You make it look almost natural. Phoebe's lips curved. What exactly? Being here, the woman replied sweetly. Among us. Before Phoebe could answer, Maverick's voice cut in cold and clear. She's here because she earned her place. Something money alone could never buy. Though you'd know about that, wouldn't you? The woman's face blanched. The nearby guests fell silent. Maverick took Phoebe's hand and guided her toward the balcony, away from the prying eyes. You didn't have to do that, she said softly once they were alone under the city lights. I did, he replied, because I'm done pretending that their approval means anything. She looked at him, her eyes glistening. You're changing, Maverick. More than you realize, he smiled faintly. Maybe it's about time I did. Months later, Maverick and Phoebe attended the opening of their joint foundation, an initiative to fund minority entrepreneurs and women-led startups. The media called it revolutionary, investors called it risky. But for the first time, Maverick didn't care about either. When he stood before the crowd and spoke, his words came from a place of conviction he hadn't known existed within him. I used to believe power was about control, he said. But the truth is, real power begins when you stop controlling who deserves to stand beside you, and start using your voice to open doors for those who've been kept outside too long. Phoebe watched him from the front row, pride softening her expression. When their eyes met, it wasn't just love that passed between them. It was respect, equality, and shared purpose. Later that night, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the glittering skyline, she leaned against him and whispered, Do you regret any of it? He turned to her, brushing a stray curl from her face. Not a second. You didn't just change my life, Phoebe. You changed me, she smiled. Then it was worth it. The city lights shimmered below them, the noise fading into silence. Two worlds that were never meant to meet had collided, and somehow created something unbreakable. And as the wind carried her laughter into the night, Maverick Knight realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want control, he just wanted her. Success had a way of attracting storms. For months, Maverick and Phoebe had been unstoppable, their foundation thriving, their partnership celebrated by those who saw beyond color and class. But power, when shared, always unsettled those accustomed to holding it alone. The first crack appeared at a board meeting. The air inside the glass-walled conference room was thick with tension. Bernard Global and Knight Industries had just announced their joint expansion into Africa, a move that promised billions but also threatened traditional power dynamics. Maverick stood at the head of the table, sharp in a tailored charcoal suit, explaining the logistics. Phoebe sat beside him, her presence steady and composed. When he finished, silence followed. Then Charles Wentworth, Maverick's longtime partner and now his most persistent critic, leaned forward. "This is reckless," Charles said, his voice dripping with controlled disdain. "We're merging our resources based on idealism, not strategy. And let's be honest, the market doesn't respond well to this kind of publicity." "Publicity?" Maverick's tone was calm but edged with danger. Charles smirked. "You know what I mean. This partnership, and it's too emotional, too personal. Investors are starting to wonder whether you're thinking with your head or your heart." Phoebe didn't flinch. She turned to him with quiet confidence. "If building inclusive markets and investing in untapped potential makes us emotional, then maybe the problem isn't with us. Mr. Wentworth, maybe it's with the way this industry defines logic." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Maverick's lips curved in a faint, proud smile. Charles leaned back, his jaw tight. "Just don't say I didn't warn you when this idealism cost you everything." Maverick's eyes darkened. "The only thing I've ever lost in business is respect for people who confuse fear with foresight." The meeting ended, but the war had begun. Over the next few weeks, rumors began to swirl. Stories of insider trading, whispers about financial mismanagement, and subtle media attacks that all pointed in one direction: Maverick Knight and Phoebe Bernard. It started small, an anonymous article here, a leaked document there, until it snowballed into headlines that questioned their integrity. Investors pulled out. Stock prices wavered. Behind closed doors, Phoebe stared at the reports spread across her desk, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Someone's orchestrating this," she said. Maverick nodded grimly. "And I know who." He was right. Charles Wentworth had found the perfect weapon: public perception. When Maverick confronted him, Charles didn't deny it. "You're losing perspective, old friend," Charles said, his tone coldly smug. "You've built an empire by keeping emotions out of the boardroom. But ever since she came along, you've forgotten what made you powerful." Maverick's voice dropped low and dangerous. "Power means nothing if you have to bury your soul to keep it." Charles laughed bitterly. "Then maybe you were never meant to hold it." He left the office that day with a new plan: to destroy everything Maverick had built. That night, Maverick and Phoebe sat on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city, silence hanging between them. The distant hum of traffic echoed below, but neither spoke. Finally, Phoebe broke the quiet. "They're not just coming for your company, Maverick. They're coming for your name." "I know. Then we fight." He turned to her, eyes weary yet resolute. "You shouldn't have to carry this with me." She met his gaze. "You think I walked into your world just to watch you fall alone? If they want a war, they'll have to face both of us." A slow smile tugged at his lips. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." "You already did," she said softly. "Once." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her fingers. "Never again." Days turned into weeks. Phoebe worked tirelessly with her legal team to trace the leaks. Maverick met with his board to regain control. Together they rebuilt their credibility step by step, until one crucial discovery changed everything. A whistleblower came forward with proof: forged documents, fake transactions, and falsified statements, all signed under Charles Wentworth's direction. It was over. Maverick arranged a final meeting at Knight Industries, calling in the entire board. When Charles entered, he looked confident, until Maverick slid a folder across the table. "These," Maverick said evenly, "are copies of the forged files you sent to the press. The digital trail leads straight to your private server." Charles froze. "You can't prove—" "Already did," Phoebe interrupted, her tone calm but sharp as glass. "The evidence is in the hands of our attorneys and the SEC." The board erupted in whispers. Charles's mask cracked, rage replacing arrogance. "You think this makes you heroes? You've destroyed your own legacy, Maverick. The world will never see you the same way again." Maverick leaned forward, his voice steady. "Maybe not, but at least now they'll finally see you for what you are." Security entered moments later. Charles's protests echoed down the hallway as he was escorted out, the sound of an empire shedding its poison. In the months that followed, Knight Industries and Bernard Global slowly recovered. Investors returned, public trust grew, and their foundation became a global model for diversity-driven innovation. The headlines shifted. From scandal to strength, Knight and Bernard redefined modern power. But beyond the noise, something even greater had happened. Maverick and Phoebe had weathered the storm, together. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of their new joint headquarters, the skyline shimmered before them. Phoebe looked up, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met?" He smiled faintly. "I'd probably still be running an empire built on emptiness." She turned toward him. "And now?" He stepped closer, brushing a kiss across her forehead. "Now I'm building something real. With you." For a moment, silence wrapped around them. The city lights below flickered like distant stars, and the wind carried the sound of hope. Two people from different worlds, a black woman who refused to bow and a white billionaire who learned to rise, had rewritten the story no one believed could exist, not a story of power and privilege, but of courage, transformation, and love that refused to be silenced. And as they stood hand in hand, the night stretched endlessly before them, no longer a battlefield but a beginning. 2 years later, the world looked very different for both of them. Maverick Knight and Phoebe Bernard had not only rebuilt their names, they had redefined what it meant to lead. Their joint foundation, the Horizon Initiative, had funded over 100 minority-owned startups across 5 continents. Their companies, once questioned and undermined, now stood as models of ethical leadership and innovation. But even as their professional empire flourished, the change that mattered most wasn't in numbers or profits. It was in hearts. In Maverick's, where arrogance had once lived, compassion had taken root. In Phoebe's, on where walls had once protected her, love now bloomed freely. The man who once said he'd never look twice at a black woman now spent his mornings watching her sleep beside him, his hand tracing the soft curve of her shoulder as if afraid she might disappear. And the woman who had vowed never to love a man who represented everything she fought against now stood beside him, not in his shadow, but in equal light. Their wedding wasn't what the world expected. No royal ballroom, no press coverage, no extravagance. Instead, they chose something simple, a quiet garden ceremony at her late mother's home in Charleston. The air smelled of jasmine and magnolia. The sky was a soft watercolor of pink and gold as the sun sank beyond the trees. Only close friends and family attended. Richard Bernard walked his daughter down the aisle, his eyes glistening with pride and emotion. Maverick stood beneath an arch of white roses, his breath catching when he saw her. She wore a gown of ivory silk, timeless, elegant, with no jewels except the small locket that had belonged to her mother. When she reached him, he whispered, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Phoebe smiled. "And you're late," she teased, her voice trembling just enough to betray the emotion beneath. The officiant smiled gently and began the ceremony. When it came time for vows, Maverick took a deep breath, his voice thick but unwavering. "I used to think love was a weakness," he began. "That caring made you vulnerable. But then I met you, a woman whose strength didn't come from what she had but from what she gave. You made me see the world differently. You made me different. I used to build walls. You taught me how to build bridges. And I promise, for as long as I live, I'll keep crossing them to find you." Phoebe's eyes filled with tears. When it was her turn, her voice was soft, steady, and powerful. "You once told me control was power," she said. "But love, real love, is the greatest power there is. You didn't just love me when it was easy. You stood beside me when it was hard. You faced your world, your fears, your own reflection, and chose me. For that, I choose you. In every lifetime, in every world, in every version of who we could be." When they kissed, the guests rose to their feet. Applause mingled with laughter and tears, echoing through the garden like music. Later that night, as the celebration faded and stars filled the sky, they sat together under the old oak tree in the garden, barefoot and silent. Phoebe leaned against his shoulder. "Do you think they'll ever stop talking about us?" Maverick chuckled. "Probably not." "Good," she whispered. "Let them talk. Maybe it'll make someone else braver." He turned, kissing her temple. You've always been the brave one. No, she said, looking up at him. We both were. We just learned that courage looks different on everyone. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the soft hum of the night. Somewhere in the distance, fireflies blinked like tiny stars. Maverick reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Phoebe raised a brow. You already gave me a ring. This isn't that, he said, opening it. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet engraved with 2 words, for change. It's the motto of the foundation, she said softly. He nodded. It's also our story. 2 people who changed themselves, and in doing so changed everything around them. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. You really are a poet when no one's watching, he laughed quietly. Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation. A year later. The camera flashbulbs clicked as Maverick and Phoebe stood on the steps of the United Nations building, addressing a global forum on corporate equality and sustainable development. Behind them, the banner read, "The future is built together." Phoebe spoke first. Her voice carried steady confidence. For too long, power has been defined by who holds it, not by who shares it. But change doesn't begin in boardrooms, it begins in hearts, in homes, in how we see each other. Maverick stepped forward next to her. I once built my empire on control. Now I build it on trust. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love and leadership aren't opposites. They're partners. You can't lead the world if you can't love the people in it. The room erupted into applause. Reporters flashed cameras. But for Maverick and Phoebe, the moment wasn't about the recognition. It was about the journey that had led them there. They clasped hands. The same hands that once reached across the divide of pride and prejudice now built a bridge that others could cross. That evening, they returned home, exhausted but happy. Maverick poured them each a glass of wine and led her to the balcony. The city shimmered beneath them. The same city where their story had begun, where judgment once tried to tear them apart. Phoebe leaned against the railing, watching the lights. Do you ever wonder what people think when they see us now? Maverick smiled faintly. I don't, because whatever they see it's real. She turned to him, her voice tender. And that's enough. He kissed her softly. It's everything. The camera would fade there, the billionaire and the woman the world once underestimated, standing together not as symbols of controversy, but as proof that love, when rooted in respect and courage, can rewrite history itself. Their story wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a legacy of change, of equality, of love that broke barriers and built empires of hope instead. And as the night wrapped around them, Maverick Knight and Phoebe Bernard, 2 souls from different worlds, stood as one. Not just partners in life, but partners in change.